Well, good morning. First of all, if you're enjoying your breakfast, please bon appetit. I hope you'll have a wonderful time. We're here today to talk about a rather broadly set perimeter, namely sustainable transition within the current financial system and future digital era. Now, I don't know about you, but all three of those raise many, many questions in and of themselves. However, I don't think an hour and a half is enough to truly divulge into each and every one of those. And so I've decided to kind of reframe, ta-da, what a surprise, this entire talk. What we will get into, I'll get into in a bit. I'll first tell you who this. So as Mia said, I've been working around the world. I try to simplify complexity, and I do so because I genuinely think that the story of progress needs renewal. This is why the work I do really focuses on that. I work across strategy, product, and design, work with a variety of companies around the world. This is me with long hair and my dogs, whom you might be able to see there and there. I've been doing a couple of talks around topics such as sustainability, business strategy, etc. If you go to my website, you can also schedule a cup of coffee with me. Now, we live in the middle of forests in Småland. Why would you want to do that? You may wonder. The fact of the matter is that if we're truly serious about sustainability, we need to put action behind words, which is why I moved to the forest of Småland. One of the main, I believe, solutions that we're going to need when it comes to sustainability is a concept called regenerative agriculture. Now, I come from a small village. Yes, there was a lot of farming around. However, I did not grow up on a farm. That said, what I'm trying to do at the moment is build a homestead based on regenerative principles, which means that I'm going to be using animals to sequester carbon. I'm going to try and use permaculture and no-dig methods in order to grow vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. I believe this is a movement that is going to be really, really important when we think about the future of food, but we can talk about that later. You're not here to talk about regenerative agriculture, however. You're here to talk about the sustainable transition within the current financial system and the future digital era. And you think about that, that's quite the ask. And in an attempt to try and be somewhat useful for you as an audience, I've steered away from the generalist, oh, we need to have everything circular and no more carbon emissions and no more fossil fuel. And then the blockchain will govern all of our choices and AI will solve all the inefficiencies and we'll be happily ever after type of techno optimist cowpoo. So I come to you today in an attempt to set some baselines around the topics that we've mentioned above. After that, I'll be talking about essentially what I think should be some guiding principles for citizens, communities, business, government, and advocates when it comes to the changes we're looking to achieve within our societies, as diverse as they are. Because I believe that we're traveling through an incredibly important junction for mankind as a species and the way we wish to live. So I want to talk about these underlying realities to demystify the realms in which we work and all the good intentions with which I'm sure most of us here in the sustainability field work and live. But we can't lose sight of the bigger picture, the raison d'être, if you will, of being alive. What does it mean? Why do we do it in the first place? Why do we need this transition? I'm going to be sharing some concepts and ideas with you, and some of them will sound utterly ridiculous. Some of them might even sound properly mad. So I encourage you strongly to take some notes, to read up on the concepts that you hear today. Don't believe anything I say. Don't do it. You know, look it up, research for yourself, and then subsequently try and implement these findings that you're going to be coming across into your future thinking and acting when it comes to acting responsibly. Because more broadly, I think acting responsibly is the only thing that's going to lead us to true sustainability. And in order to get that process going, I'm going to talk through 4 different chapters today. You're not going to be surprised. The first one is going to be sustainable transition. Where are we and what's going on? The second, current financial system. What is it? How does it work? The third one, the digital era. A quick journey through the past, present, and future of digital. And the fourth one, I'm going to keep as a little surprise. Now, before we do that, let's set the stage. And a little quote to set the mood. When I criticize a system, they think I criticize them. And that is, of course, because they fully accept the system and identify themselves with it. And today, I'd like to ask you not to do so. I'll be critiquing our status quo and how we got there quite a bit today. Nobody of you needs to agree with me, or even believe me for that matter. What I do need you to believe, however, is that I am not critiquing you as a person for the ideas or beliefs that you may or may not have. I'm here today to talk about a hope for a better human civilization, to hopefully give you some food for thought, and perhaps share a thing or two that you didn't know about. Take it or leave it, boo me or cheer me, I'll love you anyway. Okay, that's my promise to you. So let's get going. If you hadn't caught on yet, today's gonna be a bit of a ride. But let's start here. This is Earth, our home, a bowl of crusted lava hurling through time and space. Importantly, to understand about this home of ours is that resources are limited and the ecosystem is one that is defined as a closed loop, i.e., there is what there is, nothing will be added, nothing will be deducted. Things may take different forms, think like gas, liquid, solid for that state of change, but don't be mistaken. From a cosmological perspective, i.e. the multiverse, everything that ever will be is already there. That said, somehow we have convinced ourselves that a healthy economy must grow, that throwing away more than 30% of the food that we produce is just the cost of doing business, that planned obsolescence is a normal design and business practice. We dump over 12 million tons of plastic waste into our waterways annually. You know, that's the stuff we drink and that contains more than 70% of what we are physically. And as a result of that, we consume potentially up to 5 grams of microplastics a week. We're now even finding microplastics in fetus. And I haven't even mentioned the part where most of the economic growth that we're looking for actually primarily benefits a particular subset of people. We're going to get into that. However, I think it's safe to say that we're in a bit of a pickle. Let's call that pickle the polycrisis. It's a crisis that describes the systemic relationships human beings have with our ecosystems, ourselves, and each other. And I'd argue that it is a relationship that is under more distress than ever in recorded history. And I am of the opinion that a lot of this can be traced back to a singular myth, which is everlasting growth in a closed system. And yet, that is how we're thinking about sustainable transition. It's a business case, a problem to be solved without rocking the boat too much. If we just stop emitting carbon, if we just replace all the combustion engines with electric ones, or for which, by the way, we don't actually have the energy infrastructure nor the baseline energy capacity for that matter. And I understand that this has become a somewhat radical thing to say these days, but okay, let's park that for now. That said, if we only create circular value chains, or individually speaking, fewer holidays, less eating of meat, shorter showers, you know, be a decent goddamn human being. Which brings us to part one. Sustainable transition. And it must be my lucky day because this very week, the most powerful people in the world came together to solve the climate crisis for the 28th time. COP28 is a meeting where UN member states convene to assess progress in dealing with climate change and to make a plan for climate action within the guidelines of the Paris Climate Agreement. So before we look at the emissions gap report that was published last week to set the direction for the conference by the UN, quick question. What does COP stand for? Is it A, climate opportunity promotion, B, conference of the parties, or C, climate of the planet? Mia, this is your cue. Then it is indeed a conference of the parties. And these conference of the parties must commit, according to the UN GAP report, to more ambitious goals than are currently outlined in the Paris Climate Agreement in order to keep us on the path to 1.5 degrees. Now, that's interesting because when you look at the policies around the world, there's only 3 countries that appear to have policy in place that aligns with the Paris Climate Agreement in the first place, which is somewhat worrying, right? But let's see what the UN Executive Director for Climate Change, Simon Steele, had to say in his opening address to COP28.
If we do not signal the terminal decline of the fossil fuel era as we know it, we welcome our own terminal decline. And we choose to pay with people's lives. Science tells us we have around 6 years before we exhaust the planet's ability to cope with our emissions, before we blow through 1.5 degree limit. It's simply not enough for us to be trying to try. Dear delegates, remember this. Behind every line you work on, every word or comma you wrestle with here at COP, there is a human being, a family, a community that depends on you. Turn the badges around your necks into a badge of honor and a life jacket for the millions of people you are working for. Accelerate climate action.
Well, that's a good start, right? Urgency, strong wording, terminal decline, life jackets. Good. So I'm sure the UN, that is organized the conference in such a way that it's going to be success towards the objectives around reducing and phasing out fossil fuels, making sure that our economies actually are robust enough to be able to finance it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's meet COP28 President Sultan Al Jaber. That kind of seems to be missing the point, right? And that does too. And a small point on this, because we're repeatedly told that the science is clear, right? Well, there actually is quite a bit of debate, which includes Nobel Prize winners, former founders of Greenpeace. It is not as settled as it is. And frankly, I personally feel that there should be a lively debate about the biggest transition we've ever undertaken as a species. In a free and just society, open debate is crucial to how we're going to be living. And that should not be an ideological or political debate. It should be an honest, intellectual, scientific debate. And especially as we seem to have forgotten how to live in balance with our ecosystem, and we need to rediscover what that looks like. And therefore, it is really important that things like this don't happen, right? Vested interest is taking hostage of one of the most important topics in mankind's history. And the thing is that this transition does not only talk about sustainability, it goes beyond sustainability into the realms of democracy and governance. And unfortunately, we're seemingly moving towards an increasing polarization and deepening divide between people, largely along the lines of income and social position, which is deeply problematic. One of the supposed great successes of Western quote unquote civilization is the ability to generate societal wealth in a fair and just fashion. Unfortunately, however, we've seen tides are shifting. My own country just went through what some would consider a shock election of Geert Wilders, whom I personally am not quite a fan of, but I personally don't consider this as a shock. I consider it as a logical consequence of ignoring a large part of the population in socio-economic conversations like the one on climate. Does that excuse in any way, shape, or form or justify the anti-Muslim rhetoric and exclusion of people? No, exclusion is unacceptable in the occurrence of a free society. And no matter what the grounds are, and whether you may or may not think that it is a good thing for this to be censored, or that a good or that a group of people that should be excluded, that's not the point. Justification for exclusion is always grounded in the wrong place, because reality is that trying to bully, shame, or censor people into submission is not acceptable if we want to live in a fair and just system. And when it comes to climate crisis, neither is hiring Wopke Hoekstra, another Dutch guy who has been selected, not elected, as the EU climate commissioner in October. It wasn't too easy for him, however, because there were over 50 organizations such as the Europe Observatory, Corporate Europe Observatory, Friends of the Earth, and Greenpeace that released a statement prior to him being selected. And I'm going to read something from that statement. I quote, "We believe Mr. Hoekstra is not the right person for this crucial position. Not only does he lack expertise and experience in dealing with climate change issues, he has also a history of aligning very closely to fossil fuel interests. Specifically," and I'm just giving you a selection, there's more, but here it comes. "Specifically, we have the following concerns about Mr. Hoekstra. During his private and political career of over 20 years, he has no record of individually promoting or pushing policies and measures that contribute to solving the climate crisis. He also has no experience in international climate negotiations. Instead, he has a track record of working for over 15 years between 2002 and 2017 with corporations that promote fossil fuel interests. I am talking about the EU climate commissioner. Just think about this for a sec. All right, now we see that he was at Shell before he moved on to McKinsey, who is also one of the primary advisory partners for COP28. So let's look at what McKinsey is saying, because McKinsey is arguably the world's leading management consultancy in the world. They work with governments and corporations. They have a revenue of over $15 billion in 2021. They are also, as I said, the main advisory partner to COP28. So from their website, I quote, "Meaningful momentum toward net zero is building. Still, the transition is not moving fast enough. COP28 is a significant moment for a global community to collaborate on bold actions that can accelerate progress," interesting word, "measured in months, not decades. Together, we can drive climate action and growth and reimagine the net zero transition." All right, let's switch gears for a second here and look at what John Oliver has to say about McKinsey.
For all its talk of making the world a better place, it's worked for some of the planet's biggest polluters while getting hundreds of millions of dollars in return. In fact, one of those disillusioned employees paints a pretty damning portrait of what the company is at its core.
They serve a lot of clients with really harmful effects. They know exactly what the repercussions are going to be, and then they say, we're going to do it anyway. And that tells you all you need to know about the firm.
And so this news article came out 2 weeks ago. It's an interesting take on reimagining net zero. I'll give him that, very creative. But yeah, this is not great, is it? So the president is trying to use COP28 to facilitate oil deals. The main advisory party is also trying to push oil deals. And the new EU commissioner for climate is an ex-Shell employee and has been working to promote fossil fuels for the last 20 years. Now, let's go back to the UN climate czar for some more encouragement.
Is the great enabler for climate action. We need to get away from the notion that funding for developing countries is charity or development aid. As long as we think of climate funding this way, it remains vulnerable. It can be cut as soon as domestic political considerations dictate it. We need to see investing in climate mitigation and adaptation everywhere as enlightened self-interest.
Now, I was not aware of what enlightened self-interest was, so I looked it up. And apparently, it simply means that acting towards all others the way one wants to act towards oneself. Now, an explanation for that is example, I won't steal because if I steal, then others will steal and that will hurt me because it will create a thieving society. Similarly, for companies, it means that them doing good will result in a return on investment. Very logical. The question I have, however, is what if finance is the enlightened self-interest of our world leaders in business and government? What is that going to mean for us? Because the fact of the matter is that our growth that keeps on being referred to in terms of the climate crisis, we need to grow our way out of it, essentially, and our growth has always been intrinsically linked to emissions. As you can see here, the only times emissions in our recent history have dropped is during times of crises, right? The oil crisis, the end of the Soviet Union, the global financial crisis, and most notably, what most of us, like last time this happened, most of us were locked in our homes if you didn't live in Sweden, which was the only notable exception that did not lock people into their homes in the Western context, which, you know, we need to think about whether that is the world we want to live in. We need to think about whether we want to give our governments the power to tell us to stay in our homes. Because last time I checked, they worked for me. It's a representative democracy, let's not forget. Anyway, that brings us to part 2 of our conversation today, which is the current financial crisis. And again, let's set a baseline because language matters. What is finance? Well, finance is defined as the management of large amounts of money, especially by government and large business. Okay, now what is our financial system? What we're getting here is essentially a set of parameters, right? It's a set of institutions such as banks that permits the exchange of funds, financial markets, financial services, instruments. But what does that really tell us? So far we've learned that our financial system is the management of large amounts of money by governments and large companies that allow the exchange of funds. Now, time for another question. Mia, are you ready? What is the etymology of economy? Is it A, a system of production and consumption, B, the sustainable management of resources, or C, gross domestic product? Then, the correct answer, ladies and gentlemen, or otherwise, is management of household. Now, interestingly, it comes from the Greek, which is oikos, meaning house, and nemen, which is manage. This then became economia, if you will. I'm probably absolutely ripping up that pronunciation, but okay, my Greek isn't great. However, it's interesting that when we think about the economy, we often think about consumption, production, right? As we saw in the survey just now. Whereas the sustainable management of the sustainable management of resources has a very different philosophical connotation, right? That's way more than production and consumption. And it's important to think about that. While we do that, let's talk about money, right? What is money? Well, it's a medium of exchange in the form of notes and coins. Now, interesting, what is the value of money and what determines it? Now, what we get here is aggregate supply and demand, but that doesn't really give me an answer, does it? So maybe I need to rephrase my question. What I want to know is how is our money, this was so funny. Yes, how is our money made and how is its value determined? Now, before we go into that, another question. Mia, are you ready? Survey number 2. What is a fiat currency? See this? Great. Okay, so we actually have a fairly large amount of people who know what a fiat currency is. So this is a currency that's backed by belief and agreement. Now, this is one of those concepts where earlier I said I might be telling you things that are absolutely insane. But, you know, because I'm just a dude, right? And I'm just here. Let's look at let's say a World Bank senior advisor and what they say about currencies and our money.
Private banks create money out of nothing and lend it at interest. Now, that sounds absurd. When I teach sophomores, about money and banking and how banks, they never believe it. And so you have to go through it again and again. Yes, banks really do create money. They really do. Here's how it happens. And it's absurd, and they're right to doubt that could possibly be what's really going on. But it is.
Now, if the banking lobby is very strong, they're going to say, well, we don't want to change this system. We're making so much money out of it. What we have to do is, A, try and convince the people that it's their fault, that their wage claims are too high, and that's why we're having lots of inflation, or people are speculating on housing, and that's why house prices are going up. What they're not going to say is that this is happening because banks are creating money out of nothing and pumping it into the system, and that's why prices are going up.
But how is it that we've ended up with a system in which banks have the power to create money? Since 1971, when President Nixon took the United States off what was left of the gold standard, the world has operated under a system of money known as fiat. The dollar, the pound, the euro are all government fiat currencies. Fiat is a Latin word meaning let it be so. It is the law that this government currency be money. Indeed, without that legal enforcement and the fact that we must pay taxes with this money, that dollar bill or that computer digit that represents a dollar would be pretty much meaningless. Only the government has the power to issue fiat money, but banks can create it through lending. Over the last 40 years, since this system of fiat money became the global norm, the supply of money has grown exponentially. In fact, we've seen the greatest growth in the supply of money in history. But who benefits? Of course, those that have the power to issue money, governments and banks. Then, those companies and individuals that get this money early. They can spend it before the prices of the things they want to buy have risen to reflect the new money in circulation. In other words, they get services, products or assets cheap. But prices soon rise, so holders of assets such as houses or shares will then see gains without there necessarily being any improvements to the company or house in question. Often this can lead to speculative bubbles. But what about those at the bottom of the pyramid? Those on fixed wages or incomes, those who live in remote areas, or those with savings? By the time this newly created money has filtered down to them, the prices of the things they want to buy have increased. Their savings buy them less, however, and their wages remain largely unchanged. In some cases, they have to take on debt just to be able to afford the things they were previously able to buy, which means they have to go back to the banks. In reality, this process of creating money only redistributes wealth from the bottom to the top of the pyramid, and thus that ever-increasing gulf between rich and poor gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, when you get off the gold standard and you go into a fiat money currency, combined with a fractional reserve banking system, you end up compounding debt faster than you can ever possibly produce to support that debt. So eventually you're going to find yourself back into debt slavery. And that's what's happened in the U.S. For every dollar of GDP, for example, in the U.S., it also creates something like $5.50 worth of debt, because this is what happens when our economy flips over and basically capsizes. And of course, the government solution now to address all the problems is basically to create more debt.
You can never get enough of a currency that doesn't work. You can print it till kingdom comes, but you can't print wealth, and you can't get yourself out of debt by making more debt. If you could print wealth, Zimbabwe would be the largest, most prosperous country on the planet. We all know it doesn't work.
Of the money in the world today, 97% of it is debt. The French philosopher Voltaire once said, "All paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value, zero."
All right. So the richest 1% own more than half, or own almost half of the world's wealth, whilst the poorest half owns just 0.75. 81 billionaires have more wealth than 50% of the world combined. Now, interestingly, none of the world's top industries would actually be profitable if they paid for natural capital. So the only reason these millionaires share in asset holders are making a quote-unquote profit is because we're ignoring externalities or natural capital. But okay, let's look at an example. We heard about in the video, we heard about money creation. Over the last 3 years, a lot of new money has been created to battle COVID. The number's been rising since from this 9 trillion, but I can't even count to 9 trillion. So let's just use that as an example because it doesn't really matter when we're talking about these types of numbers. And let's see how that money ended up according to Oxfam. And what we're seeing is that the richest 1% ended up gaining 63% of that new wealth creation over the last 3 years. And we've just learned that the growing inequality and staggering inflation was not, in fact, due to the pandemic. It was the creation of money. Even the whole Russia caused the inflation is, in the light of understanding how our system is designed, something we have to question. And if we combine that with the environmental pressures, we find that the world's largest companies not actually being profitable because they're not taking into account natural capital, the people operating them are also not even paying taxes, which we know from the Panama Papers. And on top of that, this group is also the largest emitters of CO2 emissions, to the point that 10% are responsible for 50% of global emissions. 72 companies are responsible for more than half of all global emissions. And who is the richest 1%? Well, according to Credit Suisse, these are individuals with more than 1 million USD of wealth. Now, time for another question. Mia's almost ready. What is the COP president's job? A, is he the Minister of Industry and Advanced Technology in the United Arab Emirates? B, is he the group CEO of ADNOC, which is the UAE oil company? Or is he the chairman of Masdar, which is the UAE Initiative for Renewable Energy Investment? All right, seems sentiment is pretty clear. Now, in reality, he's all of them. If you don't believe me, this is a screenshot from his LinkedIn. And so, you know, are you still with me? Because this is sounding pretty fucking insane if you ask me. Like, you know, we're talking about all these things, and I'll just quickly recap what we've heard so far. So one, the world's most important climate conference is not doing what it says it should be doing. Two, our money is essentially based on belief, and it seems to benefit a particular subset of our populations. And three, growth is linked to emissions, and growth is part of all of the sustainability talk. Sound fair so far? Yeah, I see some nods. Good. All right. Well, let's move on to the digital era because this is such a good news show. Hey, let's look at what they thought in 1993.
It spans the globe like a superhighway. It is called Internet. The net to longtime users.
Internet is a whole group of networks.
The net is made up of some 12,000 individual computer networks. Internet began back in 1969. It was a tool of the Pentagon. But nowadays, just about anyone with a computer and a modem can join in, usually for a nominal fee.
When Carol Phillips wants to know what's going on in her community, she takes a walk to the computer in her family room. Critics say one danger is this could turn out to be an elitist system, one available only to people with a computer and a modem. Phillips connects to Cupertino, California's city-run network, CityNet.
An effort to harness the information explosion, to allow the high-tech flow of facts and figures between government, business, schools, and citizens. Computers, databases, and consumer electronics, designed to put vast amounts of information at users' fingertips.
One of its greatest achievements appears to be as an aid in scientific research. By tapping into internet, scientists can share knowledge with another scientist at lightning speed.
And thus widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Internet keeps growing, adding users and services.
Promoting the information superhighway, Vice President Gore on Wednesday said he could foresee the day when a youngster just home from school given a choice between Nintendo and the Encyclopedia Britannica, would choose to access the encyclopedia. If that is so, that might be even a greater accomplishment than the technology.
Well then, they were right about some things, not so right about others. Yeah. So a quick timeline, in keeping with old graphics, I chose to honor this one. So a quick timeline, quick walkthrough. 57, Sputnik was launched, right? This kicked it all off. The first man-made satellite to orbit Earth. Then, in the late 60s, DARPA was created by the Pentagon. And then in 1993, Tim Berners-Lee creates the World Wide Web. And they forgot to mention it, but in 1994, I went online for the first time. But let's zoom out. What are the defining traits of our internet? I'm going to go through the evolutions of the web. Now, Web 1 was essentially about open, decentralized protocol, such as email, web, right? Basic protocols for us all to be digitally connected. It was community governed, right? Early stage. This is actually what also Reddit is very much still based on, right? This governance principle. It had limited functionality. There was no value buildup within the network. And most importantly, it was a revolutionary time. It was a time of free thinkers and rebels looking to change the way our system worked, how we governed ourselves. And so to share a little bit of that spirit with you here today, here is the declaration of an independent cyberspace as per John Barlow in 1996, who was one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
A declaration of the independence of cyberspace, as written by John Perry Barlow at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland on February 8th, 1996. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one, so I address you with no greater authority than that with which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You have neither solicited nor received ours.
Well, that's pretty revolutionary, isn't it? So let's see how the spirit has fared since 1996, because today we are in Web 2. And our Web 2 is defined by siloed, centralized services such as Google, Facebook, and Twitter. It's corporation owned. It has advanced functionality, but not particularly broad functionality. And the value accrues and is built up towards the big tech companies in the world. And our use of the internet is actually reflecting that, right? In 2021, more than 50% of all internet traffic was created by these 6 companies. And even more so, 3 companies today are actually generating over a third of global web traffic. And on top of that, 5 companies, and those are technology companies, represent over 50% of the total NASDAQ 100 value, right? Interestingly, therefore, the wealth divide doesn't just happen on like the regular monetary level, it also happens in our financial markets, right? 5% of these companies in the NASDAQ 100 represent 50% of the total value of the NASDAQ 100, which is insane if you think about it, right? On to Web3 then. And Web3 is characterized by decentralized blockchain, i.e. examples of that are Bitcoin, Ethereum, Cardano, right? They are community governed, they have advanced functionality, and the value is actually accrued within the network participants, i.e., if you are on that platform, you will be generating value. And the key here really is governance, because the internet, as opposed to the revolutionary spirit that we heard about earlier, has followed very much the same pattern of centralization and consolidation of power, like government, industry, and finance have over the last 50 years. And so this idea of the whole new internet thing is for us to actually take back that power. And the hype around Bitcoin and Ethereum, or even Dogecoin, if you will, are largely reflective of the seductive pool of speculation and self-enrichment. However, the underlying technology is potentially paradigm shifting, because it allows users and networks to self-govern, to operate outside of a centralized system. And now I hear you think, why does this matter, dude? Well, let's take stock of something that happened about 10 years ago, right? When someone came out and said, I do not want to live in a world where everything I do and say is recorded. This is not something I am willing to support or live under. Any guesses who this was? Quick, just unmute yourself if you know. Oh, we're so shy this morning. Come on. Interesting. So the first one was a terrorist. The other one is a persecuted journalist. We're moving into the right direction. But we're talking about Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden, working with one of the world's largest military industrial intelligence organizations, found something. Now, what did he find? He found that since 2007, every major technology company had been onboarded into an NSA program called PRISM. Now, what was PRISM? PRISM is a program by the NSA, as I mentioned, that allows for them to harvest everyone's data, from email to chat to video to photos to voice, file transfers, video conferences, everything. Which is pretty damning, right? If you did your pre-reads, you've seen Shoshana Zuboff's bit on surveillance capitalism. This is where that comes from, right? This is official government policy to spy on you. And this is not just an American problem, right? Like, the Europeans were aware of it and allowed for it to happen. Because just last year, we learned that the Danish intelligence officers or agencies were helping the NSA to spy on Angela Merkel, who happened to be the elected top representative of the German democracy. And so have we heard or seen any consequences from this? Have we seen changes in policy? Have we seen like major public uproar? All right, well, let's see what happened earlier last week. A subcommittee in the US House of Representatives was doing a hearing on the Twitter files, which is relating the relationship between the US White House and Twitter, as well as other social media platforms during the pandemic. Let's see what.
And almost 1 year since the first bombshell Twitter files. Looking back now, and my questions are for Mr. Taibbi and Mr. Schellenberger, what was the most alarming thing that you came across during your review of internal Twitter documents? And I have a number of follow-up questions, so keep it short.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think the most alarming thing that we saw was the regular stream, organized stream of communication between the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the largest tech companies in the country. They had an organized system for flagging content, not occasionally, but in enormous numbers, involving spreadsheets of accounts that ran to the hundreds and thousands. And this was shocking to us. And to the congressman's point, this isn't crazy conspiracy theory. We've already had 4 federal judges rule that they believe this activity violates the First Amendment. This is quite serious. We didn't know whether it was against the law, but we certainly thought it was shocking enough to be in the public interest. And that for me was the most serious.
All right. So let's reflect how this relates to our supposed system view, right? Because as we know, most of us are very comfortable in saying that we live in what is legally referred to as a constitutional democracy. But again, because I'm not particularly smart, I looked up what that actually means. So let's look at it, right? So it's around basic rights, honoring the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, human and of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, etc. Okay, well, we can talk about how basic rights are being honored within our societies, but let's look on. Freedom of conscience and expression. I think the example I just shared makes it really fucking clear that we do not have the freedom of expression. Next to that, privacy in civil society. I think it's also pretty clear, you know, with what we've seen from PRISM and the Snowden revelations, that privacy in civil society are not actually are really being honored. And then justice. So distributive justice, a fair distribution and the benefits of society. Have you seen any bankers go to jail after the 2009 crisis? I haven't personally, so I don't think that's really working. Corrective justice, fair and proper responses to wrongs and injuries, i.e., for instance, let's say, the top government official influencing the public debate by censoring people. I think that's also not really being discussed. Procedural justice, i.e., and this is an interesting one, use of fair procedures in the gathering of information. Again, PRISM, I don't think that's really working at the moment. Equality then, political equality, i.e., does everyone have the same right to say? Let's say, do we have a right to say who is the president of COP28, for instance? I don't think we do. And it seems that the people who are sitting on these vested interests have a lot more say in how we're moving the planet than we do, which seems to be a bit of a problem, because we should be having equality before the law. And that means that we're not being discriminated in any way, shape, or form. And I think that we're all fairly aware of the fact that that doesn't necessarily always happen. In the Netherlands, last year, there was the child benefits scandal where literally the government unleashed an AI on people receiving welfare based on their ethnicity. I.e., if you were North African, you were going to be checked. That's a bit problematic, yeah? And then economic equality. I mean, I've just shown you the distribution of the last 3 years of money creation, and I think that's pretty fucking clear too. So lastly, openness, right? Constitutional democracies are based on a political philosophy of openness and a free marketplace of ideas. The availability of information through a free press. I remind you of Assange, who literally opened up war crimes by the American regime. Yes? Where is he now? Oh yeah, wait, he's in prison. Okay, so openness is also not really working, is it? Now, what are we going to do? And what does this mean for our future of the digital era? Because as I mentioned, we are moving to Web 3.0. And there's huge potential of decentralization, redistributing equity back into networks of participation governed by community. And the crucial bit here is that we're moving away from posting to actually getting self-determination in relation to owning the content and data that we produce, as opposed to your content and creations being owned by the centralized platforms, selling your surfer or your influencer interests or your Tinder habits to the highest bidder 5 times a day. Because as the saying in the industry goes, and I've worked in this industry quite a bit, if you are not paying for the product, you are the product. And this is really clear when we start looking at the revenue numbers of these platforms that we use so often and share some of the most intimate of our thoughts and feelings. And this is changing with Web3. Because as we mentioned, the underlying technology enables us to free ourselves from the power that these organizations, from government to tech platform, have over us. Now, what does that mean for the future of a civic perspective within this digital era? So let's look at what the governments are saying. Well, the governments are saying that, hey, you need a digital ID. And this is one of the latest EU initiatives. It was essentially like rubber stamped for preparation a couple of weeks ago. And basically the idea is to have a pan-European identity service that digitizes all of your access as a general sort of like identifier, right? It will go to your banking, it will go to your mortgage, it will go to your insurance, it will go to your healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fun fact, is that the House of Representatives in the Netherlands, a couple of weeks before that vote, had voted on that matter in terms of what should the Netherlands do within the EU in terms of our relationship to this agreement. And the majority said, we don't want it. We don't want to be a part of that. Now, 2 weeks after that, the minister goes to Brussels and signs it anyway, right? And that's a bit problematic in my view. And I know that Sweden is very advanced in this digital identity, right? My question to you, however, is this. Would you trust Brussels with all this information? It is largely unelected. And there was probably a reason why Sweden, in this case, for instance, chose to keep the Svenska krona. Yeah? And these types of self-determination as a country, and sovereignty was a word that we heard earlier, that sovereignty is decreasingly possible, right? More and more policies are being made in the EU. And as a result, countries and citizens are increasingly dependent on what's happening in Brussels for policies and law. And another initiative you'll be hearing more about over the next couple of months and years is going to be explained now by the managing director of the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank in the US.
Central bank digital currency. Do you think that that is something that you all should be looking into seriously? To what degree should you be looking into it seriously? Just what are your thoughts on CBDC?
I mean, as my colleagues at the Federal Reserve have talked about, we are examining it. I'll tell you, my personal bias is I'm pretty skeptical. I keep asking anybody at the Fed or outside of the Fed to explain to me what problem this is solving. I can send anybody in this room $5 with Venmo right now. Right? No, seriously. So what is it that a CBDC could do that Venmo can't do? And all I get is a bunch of hand waving. I get a bunch, well, maybe it's better for financial inclusion. Maybe it's better for cross-border remittances. Maybe. Is there any evidence that it is? And, they say, well, what about China? China's doing it. Well, I can see why China would do it. If they want to monitor every one of your transactions, you could do that with a central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. If you want to impose negative interest rates, you could do that with a central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. And if you want to directly tax customer accounts, you could do that with a central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. So I get why China would be interested. Why would the American people be for that?
So that's in America. But in Europe, the EU's answer to the rise of digital currency, or the central bank digital currency as it's referred to more broadly, is the digital euro. And I promise you that both digital IDs and CBDCs will appear in the near future as options initially. And increasingly, these options will reduce. And increasingly, this will be a requirement for you to participate in society. And if you're somehow following this debate, you may have heard something about programmability. Now, what is programmability? It's the ability to predetermine what money can or cannot be used for. And the EU says, we'll never implement that. We'll never do that. Trust us. Don't worry about it. It's all good. Now, as we know, monetary policy is generally set by the World Bank and the IMF. So let's have a look at what the Deputy Director of the IMF, Kenji Okamura, has to say about programmability. And if you're not aware of what the IMF is, it is the International Monetary Fund, which has as its stated objective, and I quote, to achieve sustainable growth, again, and prosperity for all of its 190 member countries. One of its main functions is, together with the World Bank, to set global financing standards and policies. Now, what does Uncle Kenji have to say about programmability?
The third way we think CBDC can improve financial inclusion is through what we call programmability. That is, CBDC can allow government agencies and private sector players to program, to create smart contracts, to allow targeted policy functions. For example, welfare payment. For example, consumption coupon. For example, food stamp. By programming CBDC, those money can be precisely targeted for what kind of people can own and what kind of use this money can be utilized. For example, for food. So this potential programmability can help government agencies to precisely target their support to those people who need support.
And so that concludes part 3. Now, I have a question for you that I'd like you to think about over the next couple of days. Do you want the same organizations that are either straight up failing or consciously derailing climate talks, who've been printing money since the dawn of this system, with increasingly devastating effects on regular civilians, to determine what you can spend your money on? They've been spying on you to an extent that today we essentially live in a digital surveillance system, which is enabled by the technology platforms that all of us use for at least a minimum an hour a day on average. Does that sound like the world you want your children or your nieces or nephews or your kid next door to inherit? Because it feels to me like we're in a bit of a pickle. And as I've said before, it's pretty clear that the systemic relationship human beings have with our ecosystems, ourselves, and each other is under more distress than ever in recorded history. And all of the solutions that we've heard about today from centralized authority is being pushed to be growth-oriented and supposedly inclusive. However, if we look at what the results have been over the last 40 years, I personally have very little faith in the institutions and the people who created this mess to get us out of it. There seems to be too much interest, whether it be political, financial, or otherwise, for this to materialize. So what are we supposed to do? Where are we going from here? Well, first off, don't panic, right? Because here's part 4, which is going to be a surprise, but now it's no longer anymore. Here's the Sustainable Leader's Guide to Avoiding the Apocalypse. It's going to be great. And if you're familiar with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, from which obviously I took some inspiration here, you'll know that the answer is 42. Everything done. However, the answer may be 42. The true value lies in understanding the questions we must be asking in order to journey through the upcoming sustainable transition. So first off, rule number 1, as I said, don't panic. Don't give over to climate anxiety. Remember what the Stoics say. Understand your sphere of influence and act accordingly. Stop beating yourself up over the situation where we're in. When someone brings up the weather to talk about climate change, first of all, please tell them to stop. But second of all, take control of the situation and the conversation and talk about supply chains. Talk about value chains in a circular fashion. Talk about the need to decentralize our food production and that kiwis in November in Sweden are not a good idea. Yeah? That leads into general consumption patterns. We must rethink how we consume, how we value things, how our money works, and how we govern ourselves. And remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. We're talking about systemic change. And I know that in the age of instant gratification, this is seemingly a bit of a challenging concept, right? Patience. However, systemic change must come from a place of reason. Yes? Because everything, and I'm not exaggerating here, everything that has created the perceived wealth of Western society was created by the extraction and usage of fossil fuels. And this is not going to be changed in a year. It's not even going to be changed in 10 years, which is ironically about the same time we need in order to build new energy plants. And no, this is not, as I'm pretty sure you have gotten my point by now, this is not about sustainability. Yeah, this is about how we want to be governed. It is about how we determine value. It is about what we value. And you might think otherwise, but nobody actually knows where this is going. And if that's not true, because if we did, like, explain to me why the biggest, most important climate conference on, the most important conference on climate change, which has its stated objective to phase out fossil fuel, is presided over by an oil executive who also happens to be the Minister of Industry in one of the largest petrostates in the fucking world. Like, I'm really sorry, but that's madness. And I don't have anything against this, because the fact of the matter is we will not phase out fossil fuels over the next 20 years. It's not going to happen. I promise you that. Again, if you did your pre-read, you'll see that the whole net zero conversation is largely an exercise essentially in semantics. Yeah, and they know that, because otherwise this guy wouldn't be the fucking president of this conference. It's that simple. And despite the fact that it might, sort of make you feel some despair, I personally believe that this is actually what makes it a beautiful time to be alive. Because we have the opportunity for now to push the narrative towards sovereignty, towards constructive, realistic, democratic, inclusive, eco-responsible change. Because the fact of the matter is that, as the saying goes, for each action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And so as a result of a maturity of an increasingly corrupted centralized system, we're seeing the rise of autonomous decentralized systems. Similarly, the rise of centralized controlled currencies gives rise to decentralized digital currencies. And now a small note on this, because what I will see that we're going to start seeing in the near future is media stories about how certain cryptocurrencies are going to be spoken about as a safe haven for criminals, for terrorists, for child pornography. And these things are all a problem. I 100% agree. And but the fact of the matter is, these things existed before crypto. These things will exist after crypto. However, the problem is that the government will tell you that they have to do something because these currencies are threatening our principles of freedom, our principles of democracy and safety. And the campaign, similar to the ones that we've seen around Assange or Edward Snowden, and in a very different way around COVID or even the war in Ukraine, the truth has become increasingly blurry. It is increasingly difficult to find actual accurate information, which is objective. And the only way we can get official information now is by having an earmarked little government star. And in the case of crypto too, and in line with our action-reaction principle, there is now a solution, right? It is their centralized digital currency, which for your convenience might actually help you reduce your climate impact by choosing what you can buy so that you don't have to. And I understand this may not be the case for all of you, but I don't want to live in a world like that. All-seeing government surveillance and oversight is authoritarianism, nothing else. And it is not acceptable. And I genuinely hope that this goes for the most of us. And so from the ashes of the old, we'll shelter the seeds of renewal. And we have to choose. If we want to work in this space, we have to choose which seeds to water and which to weed out. And we must do so without being certain of what the answers are and embrace the uncertainty. Because as I said before, nobody actually knows where this is going. And that means you need to listen carefully to what values are being put forth around certain solutions. When the UN Commissioner on Climate Change says we must have inclusive growth, what does that mean to you, my friend? Because the system around money is designed to not actually do inclusivity. So what does it mean? What is truly happening? Are these words designed to calm us down and to shut us up? Or is it actually what you're saying that it is? And that means we need to think for ourselves. We need to question authority. We need to question status quo. We need a free and open public debate on these things, because this is going to shape all of our lives. This is not, again, about sustainability transformation. This is about how we want to live. And I think, and I hope that what I've shared with you today will allow you to remember that things are not what they seem. Also, I would like to give you a recommendation. Please read Haruki Murakami. He makes wonderful books. But that's a little side note. On to some more or less, maybe, philosophical elements and more practical ones. So this is the practical side of the Sustainable Leaders Guide to Avoiding the Apocalypse. There are 3 principles that I'd like you to consider when working with companies, products, or services in helping the sustainable transition. And the first one is around the principle of usefulness. What problem are we solving? Is it really a problem? Or is it a moneymaker? And what already exists that could solve this problem, right? Generally, there's 7 to 8 different solutions to a problem. Choosing the right one is the path to success. I'll give you an example. I lived in China for quite some time, and a client of mine, a large food wholesaler, was looking to improve the ability to communicate safe food, right? In the context of a variety of food scandals in that period in China. Blockchain had been around just about 2-3 years at that point and was quite the rage in terms of transparency and decentralized authority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, what we did was build a fully transparent food supply chain with the use of barcodes. Now, barcodes are one of the easiest technologies. Ironically, it was developed by McKinsey, by the way. That's just a funny side note. And the thing is, the technology was there. It was easy to deploy. It didn't cost anything because they were, open source databases, and we could actually just use the people who were there anyway, right? The driver, the person harvesting, i.e. the farmer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an example of taking something that seems very complex and trying to solve it in a very simple way with existing technology without having to spend a lot of money, right? Resources. Can we make this last forever? How can we make it disappear? How can we reuse parts? The principle of our resource economy must be rethought. Our value chains are broken, and we have to rethink how our resource economy impacts our ecosystems. This means we have to rethink about how we make and use everything around us. Not so fun fact, 65% of the things produced today end up within a landfill in the space of 8 years. I've mentioned before that more than 1/3 of the food that we produce is being thrown away. And so we have to, when we work on these topics, start with how do we use resources in the production? How do we help consumers to either continue its use through repair or recycling, or to make it disappear so that it doesn't end as waste? And then the last one is the principle of decentralization. Can you source this locally? Can it be scaled? What does knowledge sharing look like? Who are you going to partner with? Because value chain partnerships are going to be a crucial part to solving this. And the fact is that power and resources are too centralized. Today, more than 80% of all the grains around the world come from 4 companies, right? Think about food security for a second. Think about the rise of oil prices and the impact on food. We have to think about how we can reduce the kilometers of food, for instance, or how we can stop building cars in Japan or in Europe to then ship them to Asia or to Europe, to the US. This is madness. Because what you could do, for instance, around the question of scaling, is you could separate the intellectual property and the design and the processing away from the production. So you can start sourcing materials locally, right? And this also allows for full end-to-end value chains. Because the fact of the matter is that these questions are important for the simple fact that I asked you before, what does economy mean? And it was the sustainable management of resources. And so if we're transitioning, this must give rise to a new economy. And this new economy must address and transform the polycrises we have in climate and technology in the current economy. It also needs to take on the responsibility of rebuilding the demographic institutions of society along the way as we figure out what sustainable life means on Earth. Because we've never done this before since the advent of modern technology. Because I personally refuse to believe that this legalized bribery has to permeate our institutions. I refuse to believe that these levels of corruption are acceptable. And I refuse to accept that the revolving door culture between elected and non-elected officials and large financial interests is the right way to do it. And I am tired of being asked by my local governments to cede my civic right and power to an increasingly unaccountable, centralized, and arguably selected, but most definitely unelected groups of people saying one thing and doing another. Because as safe as it seems to place your trust in some large nameless institution, believing that they'll save us, they've actually brought us to where we are today. Let's not forget that. And don't get me wrong, I am 100% pro global equitable collaboration. But we must acknowledge that different places have different requirements and that different people have different needs. And the institutions that we have today are not capable and have not shown themselves capable of being representative of a globally diverse society. And I don't believe that within our current financial system, they ever will be. They have had multitude of chances to prove us otherwise. But when global pandemics become major wealth transfer events, when climate conferences turn into oil deal facilitation, wake up. We have to do better. And as friend of the show today, Mr. Steele, if you remember him, the UN SAR on climate change, said, we can't be trying to try. Well, Mr. Steele, I say to you, as Yoda did to me, there is no try, only do. Because if we are to transition to true sustainability equitably, fairly, then it is important to remember that what we're navigating is humongous changes in how mankind is living on this planet. And we've never done this before. All we've ever known, all of our wealth is based on cheap fossil fuel and energy. And consumption for the win, right? Grow, economy, grow. And this change is planetary. We've never done anything like that. Never, ever, ever in the history of our planet have we done this. Because we've never been as connected and interdependent on each other as we are today. And I think the climate crisis is underlining that interdependence. And if you've ever worked in a large organization, you'll know that change takes time, right? It's often referred to as an oil tanker changing direction, which is kind of ironic because oil tankers are the things we want to get rid of, but okay. What it means, however, is that it will be a hard and difficult journey. But we must remember that most people really value love and kindness and safety for themselves and their families. And they want to be free and they want to be comfortable. And it doesn't require you to agree with anything. But it is our collective responsibility to speak out against inequality, against violence, against dishonesty, against corruption, and demand transparent government whilst demanding civic privacy. And although we will fall,
Get up, stand up.
We must get up.
Stand up for your right. Get up.
And what many of you probably don't know is that Bob Marley's activism was actually instrumental in the decolonization of large parts of the world. He inspired millions of people. And I'm telling you this because we have to remember that we also need to have a bit of fun. Yeah? It's not all doom and gloom because it's a time of opportunity. It's a time to stop accepting that the changes we're going through are the tools of professional talkers, right? Who are trying to talk us out of caring what's going on, trying to convince us we're not smart enough to understand all of this complexity. And that, my friends, is where our opportunity is. Because as long as these powerful entities keep underestimating our power, people power, we have the chance to remind them to never underestimate a small group of people wanting to change the world. For indeed, they are the only ones that ever did. That was my talk today. Thank you for your attention. If anything caused you to question things today, good. Turn it into change.